5 true scary stories from the beach. Horror stories from the ocean. The wind howled through the cracks in the old wooden shack, its eerie whispers carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. The small coastal town of Carrington was nothing more than a forgotten speck on the map, nestled at the edge of the world where the ocean stretched into an endless expanse. To those passing through, it was just another sleepy town with an old lighthouse and too many overcast days. But to the locals, Carrington was something else. A place where the ocean had a will of its own. A place where something ancient and restless lay just beneath the waves. It was the late 1970s when the young traveler first arrived, fresh-faced and eager for a taste of the quiet life. He came with the naive enthusiasm of a man who'd heard the rumors, those wild tales spun by locals and hushed voices. Ghost stories, curses, strange happenings at sea. He figured it was all nonsense, a collection of superstitions passed down through generations to keep children in line and tourists entertained. He wasn't one for ghost stories, or at least that's what he thought. On his first evening in Carrington, the traveler wandered down to the beach, fascinated by the way the sky seemed to meet the water in an endless, misty embrace. The sand, dark and damp from the rising tide, clung to his boots as he walked along the shore. The ocean roared beneath a sky the color of slate, and the only sounds were the crash of waves against the rocks and the soft murmur of the wind. The old fisherman watched him from the edge of the dock, his face weathered by years of salt and sun. He'd seen tourists come and go, all of them brimming with youthful arrogance and dismissive of the local tales. He'd seen them laugh, had their fun, and then disappear into the night, never to be seen again. But something about this young man piqued his interest. Maybe it was the defiance in his eyes or the skepticism that hung around him like a thick fog. Either way, the old fisherman knew he had to warn him. The young man turned as he approached, flashing a polite smile. "Beautiful place," he said, glancing out at the vast expanse of the ocean. "A bit eerie, though. What's with all the stories people tell?" The old man chuckled, his voice gravelly and low. "You'll find the sea here doesn't much care for stories. The tide comes and goes on its own schedule, and it has a way of taking what it wants. Don't believe the stories? That's fine, but there's a reason people don't go near the water after dusk." The young man shrugged, laughing lightly. "It's all superstition, right? People love their tales to make things more interesting. I'm sure there's nothing to worry about." The fisherman's eyes darkened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, as if weighing his words carefully, he spoke again. "You might want to rethink that," he murmured, looking out toward the horizon where the waves crashed relentlessly against the shore. "I've seen things here, things you wouldn't believe. And I've seen people who've been drawn into it, who didn't listen, who thought it was all a joke. They didn't last long." The traveler laughed again, but the sound was hollow this time. There was something in the old man's voice that made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The air grew colder, the breeze picking up as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The ocean seemed to breathe, its waves rolling in with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. "Stories are just stories," the young man said, trying to brush off the strange feeling growing in his chest. "But I'll be sure to stay away from the water at night. I promise." The old man nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the ocean. "Good. But when the tide comes in tonight, you'll remember what I said. The sea doesn't forget, and it always takes back what it's owed." With that, the old fisherman turned and walked slowly toward his shack, his footsteps heavy against the wooden planks of the dock. The traveler stood for a moment, staring out at the sea, the words of the fisherman lingering in his mind. There was a chill in the air now, and the wind seemed to be carrying something, whispers perhaps, or just the haunting call of the ocean. It was hard to tell, but something about the beach felt wrong. The vast emptiness of the water, too overwhelming. He shook his head, telling himself it was just the isolation of the place, the isolation of a small coastal town forgotten by time. As he walked back toward his cabin, the last traces of sunlight vanished, leaving only a dark sky filled with stars. The sound of the ocean crashing against the shore was constant, almost like a pulse, a heartbeat echoing across the land. And in the distance, just beneath the rolling waves, there was a sensation that the sea was watching him. The night deepened, and as the wind picked up, the traveler found himself unable to shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. Something beneath the surface. Something he had yet to understand. The beach, so tranquil in the daylight, had transformed into something far more ominous. And in that vast, unknowable darkness, the traveler began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake by dismissing the old man's warnings. But he would learn soon enough. The sea, like all old things, had a memory, a deep, ancient memory that could never be erased. And tonight, it would remember. With the ocean now alive with a dark, restless energy, the traveler's night was about to begin, and the stories of Carrington would become more than just tales. Story 1. The Mysterious Tide. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the vast, untouched beach of Carrington. Waves lapped gently at the shore, and the air was thick with the scent of salt water and the promise of adventure. Emma and Luke had been looking forward to this vacation for months. A chance to escape the chaotic buzz of city life and relax by the ocean, far away from the noise of work and deadlines. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a time to reconnect and recharge. But little did they know, the beach they had chosen held more than just sand and surf. It carried with it a dark history, one that would soon pull them into a nightmare they could never have imagined. The couple arrived in the sleepy town of Carrington late in the afternoon. The beach was eerily empty, save for a few locals who went about their business with knowing glances and hushed conversations. The small coastal town seemed almost frozen in time, as though the world had forgotten about it. The beach itself was vast, stretching out into the distance, bordered by jagged rocks and the endless expanse of the ocean. It was beautiful, but there was an unsettling feeling in the air, as though the ocean itself was watching them. "Isn't it perfect?" Emma said, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she set down their bags by the beach. She took in the breathtaking view, the sky painted with streaks of pink and purple as the sun began to dip beneath the waves. Luke smiled, but there was a hint of hesitation in his expression. "Yeah, it's nice. A little too quiet, though." As they unpacked, an old man approached them. His face was weathered and lined with age, and his clothes were simple, faded by years of salt and sun. His eyes, however, were sharp, studying them with a kind of intensity that made Emma shiver slightly. "You folks new here?" he asked, his voice rough, but not unfriendly. "Yeah," Luke answered. "We're just here for a few days. A little escape from the city." The old man nodded slowly. "Be careful out there," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Especially at night. Don't swim when the sun sets. The tide, it behaves differently after dark." Emma and Luke exchanged a glance, amused by the warning. It wasn't the first time they had heard a local warn them about something strange. Tourists were often given vague warnings, but they were easily dismissed as local superstition. "We'll be fine," Luke said with a smile, brushing off the man's warning. "Thanks for the tip, though." The old man didn't smile back. His eyes darkened, and he seemed to take a long, hard look at them before he turned and shuffled away, muttering something under his breath that neither of them could quite catch. That evening, after a quiet dinner in the small town, the couple found themselves back on the beach. The sun had set completely now, and the sky was dark, dotted with stars. The beach was empty again, save for the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of the ocean and the faintest hint of something else, something faintly metallic like rust or blood. "I guess we should have listened to that old man," Emma said, laughing lightly. "But it's just a beach, right? How bad could it be?" Luke wasn't so sure, but he didn't want to ruin the mood. "Let's just get in a quick swim. It'll be fine." They waded into the water, the coolness of the ocean enveloping them as they swam. The waves were gentle at first, just enough to make their movements feel effortless. But as they ventured further out, the water seemed to grow colder. The current picked up, pulling them deeper into the sea with alarming speed. At first, they thought it was just a stronger tide, but soon it became clear that something was wrong. Emma gasped as she felt the pull grow stronger, her limbs becoming sluggish and heavy. "Luke!" she shouted, panic rising in her chest. Something's wrong. Luke reached for her, but the current was too powerful. It wasn't just the tide. It was as if something beneath the surface was pulling them down, drawing them deeper into the dark abyss of the ocean. Their cries were drowned by the sound of the waves, and for a moment, they thought they would be lost to the sea forever. With every ounce of strength they could muster, they fought their way toward the shore. The tide seemed to recede for a moment, giving them a brief reprieve. They clawed their way back, gasping for air as they collapsed onto the sand, their bodies trembling from the cold and the terror of what they had just experienced. They lay there for a few minutes, too shaken to speak, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore now ominously calm. The beach was silent except for the whispering wind, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The ocean had felt alive, as if it had a mind of its own. That wasn't normal, Luke finally said, his voice low and shaken. Emma nodded, unable to speak. She could still feel the pull of the tide, like an invisible force tugging at her insides. Something about the water had felt wrong, unnatural even. The night passed uneventfully, but the unease lingered. As they prepared for bed in their small cabin by the beach, Emma couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw images of herself drowning, her body sinking beneath the surface, pulled deeper and deeper into the ocean. And there were whispers, faint and distant, as though the waves themselves were speaking to her, urging her to return. She awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart racing. It was still dark outside, and the sounds of the ocean were distant, like a low, mournful hum. When morning came, the couple decided to visit the beach again. But as they walked along the shore, they were stopped dead in their tracks. The sand, which had been perfectly smooth the night before, was now covered in strange, intricate symbols they couldn't recognize, etched into the sand as though by some unseen hand. "What the hell is this?" Luke whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and fear. Emma knelt down, tracing one of the symbols with her fingers. There was a sense of recognition, like she had seen them before in a dream. But the dream was fading, slipping away like the tide. The whispers from the ocean seemed to grow louder, more insistent. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it a sense of urgency, as if something was approaching. They looked out at the sea, but there was nothing there, only the rolling waves and the dark expanse of water. That night, the dreams returned. Emma dreamt of drowning again, but this time, the sensation was more vivid. She felt herself being pulled into the depths of the ocean, something cold and clammy wrapping around her ankles. She struggled, trying to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers were louder now, like a chorus of voices calling to her from below the waves. The following day, the couple sought out the old fisherman, hoping to understand what was happening. They found him sitting on the dock, staring out at the horizon, as though waiting for something. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked before they could say a word. "The tide, the symbols, the dreams." Emma and Luke nodded, too afraid to speak. "It's the curse of the sea," the old man said grimly. "The tide you felt, that wasn't just nature at work. It was something else, something ancient. There's a spirit buried beneath the sand here, a spirit of vengeance. It was buried years ago, but now the curse has been unleashed. The whispers are trying to drag you into the depths, to join the souls that were lost to the sea." Emma's blood ran cold as the old man's words sank in. The tide, the symbols, the whispers, they were all connected to something far darker than they had ever imagined. And the ocean was calling for them. The next night, they tried to leave, but the tide had other plans. The beach was no longer just a place of vacation. It had become a place of death, and no one who had ever ignored its warnings had lived to tell the tale. The curse of the mysterious tide had claimed them, as it had claimed so many before. Story 2. The Cursed Seashell. Nathaniel had always considered himself a collector, one who appreciated the oddities and relics that the world had to offer. So when he arrived in the small, secluded coastal town of Larkspur, he immediately sought out something unique, something that would make his trip memorable. The beach was a serene paradise, far from the bustling crowds of tourist-filled coasts, and Nathaniel, with his camera slung over his shoulder, wandered the sands, drawn by the call of the ocean. It was there, among the scattered debris of the tide, that he found it, an unusual seashell unlike any he had ever seen before. The shell was perfectly intact, its surface smooth and polished to a gleaming sheen. It was a soft, opalescent white, with faint streaks of iridescent blue running through it, catching the light in strange ways. When Nathaniel held it up to the sun, the shell glistened with an almost otherworldly glow, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though it hummed softly, a gentle, melodic vibration that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He had heard stories of cursed objects, tales meant to entertain and warn, but Nathaniel was a skeptic. Just a souvenir, he thought to himself, tucking the shell in his pocket as he continued to stroll along the shoreline. By nightfall, Nathaniel had forgotten the unease he felt at the moment of discovery. He had checked into a small inn, with views of the beach from the window, and after a long day of exploration, he was eager to rest. But the seashell, nestled on the small wooden table by the window, would soon prove to be more than just a trinket. That night, as he lay in bed, sleep came uneasily. He woke to the sound of something faint, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It was his name, spoken with a soft, melodic voice that seemed to emanate from the direction of the beach. At first, Nathaniel assumed it was the wind, a trick of the night air. But then, it came again. Nathaniel. Nathaniel. He sat up, his pulse quickening. The room was dark, save for the moonlight filtering through the curtains. The only sound was the persistent crashing of waves against the shore. He tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had begun to settle in his chest. "Just my imagination," he muttered, trying to convince himself. But the whisper continued, each time growing louder, more insistent. "Nathaniel, come, find me." Suddenly, a noise from the corner of the room made him turn his head. The seashell. It had moved slightly, but it was no longer in the place he had left it. It was now positioned, almost deliberately, facing the window, as though watching him. A chill ran down Nathaniel's spine. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. He dismissed it as nothing more than a strange coincidence, or perhaps a trick of the light. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew clearer, like the soft murmur of an unseen presence. Disturbed, he left his bed and went to the window. Outside, the beach was empty, bathed in the eerie glow of the moon. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease in his gut wouldn't subside. The next few days, the strange occurrences grew more frequent. Objects in his hotel room seemed to move on their own. His clothes rearranged, his books displaced. At night, the whispers from the beach never ceased. They called to him always the same, his name repeated over and over again. As time passed, the whispers began to shift. They were no longer just a distant murmur from the ocean. They were closer now, sometimes right behind him, as if someone was standing just out of sight calling to him. He couldn't escape the sensation that he was being watched. And then came the visions. The first one was subtle, a glimpse of a woman in the moonlight, standing at the edge of the water, her long, wet hair flowing in the wind. Her face was obscured, but there was something about her that felt hauntingly familiar. The next night, the vision was clearer. This time, the woman's face was visible, though it was pale and twisted in sorrow. Her eyes were wide and empty, her lips parted as though she was about to speak, but no words came. Nathaniel's dreams became more vivid and terrifying. Each time he closed his eyes, he was drawn to the ocean. The woman would appear, standing in the water, beckoning him toward her. The air grew thick with a strange pressure, the sound of the waves growing louder, drowning out everything else. Her outstretched hand seemed to pull him closer, dragging him toward the water's edge. And always her voice, soft, pleading, echoed in his mind. The seashell, give it back. He awoke in cold sweats, his heart racing, his body trembling. The nightmares were beginning to affect his waking hours. He couldn't tell where reality ended and the visions began. Desperate for answers, Nathaniel turned to the town's history, hoping to find some explanation for the strange happenings. He learned that many years ago, A woman had drowned in the very waters where he had found the seashell. Her name was Isla, and she had been a young woman who had come to the beach in search of treasure. But instead of finding riches, she had found death. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about Isla's death. Some believed it had been an accident, a victim of the cruel, unpredictable currents. But others spoke of something darker, an ancient curse that had been placed upon the beach, a curse tied to the ocean's depths. Isla's body was never recovered, and her soul, they said, was trapped in a seashell that had been found near her resting place at the bottom of the sea. The more Nathaniel uncovered, the more he realized the truth. The seashell was not just a harmless trinket. It was a cursed artifact, tied to Isla's spirit, cursed to forever haunt those who dared to possess it. The woman's restless soul had latched onto him, unable to find peace until the seashell was returned to the ocean. But every time Nathaniel tried to rid himself of it, the curse only grew stronger. The more he tried to escape it, the more powerful the pull became. The final night came when Nathaniel could no longer resist the ocean's call. The whispers were unbearable now, the woman's voice growing louder, desperate, maddening. He found himself walking to the beach, his feet moving as if guided by some unseen force. The seashell was in his hand, glowing eerily in the moonlight, and as he approached the water's edge, the pull grew stronger, as though the ocean itself was reaching out to him. With a trembling hand, he tossed the seashell into the waves, watching as it sank beneath the surface. For a moment there was silence, but then the whispers stopped, and the ocean seemed to calm. The oppressive weight that had hung over him lifted, and Nathaniel thought that he was finally free. But as he turned to walk back, he felt a cold hand wrap around his ankle. The water surged around him, dragging him under. The last thing he saw was the pale face of Isla, her eyes wide with fury and sorrow, as she pulled him down into the depths. Nathaniel's body was never found, and the seashell, now glistening with a new, eerie glow, was once again washed ashore, waiting for the next curious soul to claim it. The curse of Isla, the woman who drowned, continued to haunt the beach, a reminder of the power of the ocean and the restless spirits it kept buried beneath its waves. Story 3. The Abandoned Lighthouse. The wind howled across the coastal cliffs, carrying the scent of salt and the distant crash of waves against jagged rocks. The group of friends, 6 in total, stood at the edge of the beach, gazing up at the imposing silhouette of the abandoned lighthouse. It had loomed there for as long as anyone could remember, its once proud structure now weathered and crumbling. The locals had always spoken of it in hushed tones, warning anyone who asked that it was best left undisturbed. But to the group of friends, young, adventurous, and eager to break free from the monotony of their everyday lives, the lighthouse was an irresistible challenge. They had come to this remote beach for a weekend camping trip, far away from their busy city lives, hoping to reconnect with each other and escape the stresses of the world. When they had heard the old stories from a weathered innkeeper in the town, they hadn't been deterred. In fact, it only fueled their curiosity. The tragedy of the shipwreck, the madness of the lighthouse keeper, and the strange whispers in the wind, all of it sounded like the perfect fodder for an adventure. "Let's go explore it," said Matt, the most daring of the group. "It's just a lighthouse, right? What's the worst that could happen?" The others exchanged uncertain glances, but the lure of the unknown was too strong. They packed their gear and began their trek up the steep hill toward the lighthouse, the wind biting at their faces as they climbed. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the rocky path. By the time they reached the lighthouse, the sky had darkened into a deep, ominous blue, and the faint glow of their flashlights barely pierced the surrounding gloom. The lighthouse stood tall, its base surrounded by tangled vines and overgrown weeds. The once pristine white walls were now streaked with grime and the telltale marks of decay. The iron door was ajar, creaking slightly as they pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew, but it was the eerie silence that struck them the hardest. The place felt abandoned, but not empty. "Let's split up," Matt suggested with a grin, clearly eager to get started. "Are you sure about this? Lily, the most cautious of the group, asked. Her voice trembled with uncertainty. It feels wrong. Don't be such a buzzkill, Matt replied with a shrug. It's just an old building. Reluctantly, the group agreed. They separated into smaller pairs, each taking a different staircase that spiraled up the lighthouse tower. As they climbed higher, the air grew colder, and the feeling of unease only deepened. The walls were covered in strange, cryptic carvings, scratches and symbols that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. Some of them looked like nautical motifs, others like faces twisted in pain or fear. What do you think these mean? Dave asked, his flashlight illuminating a grotesque image of a ship crashing into jagged rocks. I don't know, said Sarah, her voice low, but I don't like it. We should have listened to the locals. But the group was too deep into the lighthouse to turn back now. They continued exploring, finding old, rotting furniture and remnants of what had once been a home. A table was littered with old, brittle books, their pages yellowed with age, and a single chair sat facing the window, as if waiting for someone to sit in it. As they ascended to the top of the lighthouse, the wind outside grew louder, howling around the tower, and strange sounds began to echo through the dark, empty halls. It was as if someone was moving in the shadows, following their every step. The unsettling feeling of being watched crept into their minds. But it wasn't until they heard a faint whispering voice that the true horror began. Matt, Sarah called out, her voice shaking with fear. Did you hear that? It's nothing, Matt said, though his voice faltered. Just the wind. But the whispering grew louder, more insistent, as though it were coming from the walls themselves. The others stopped, their flashlights shaking in their hands. The air grew thick with an unseen presence, suffocating them with its weight. Then, the first scream shattered the silence. It was Lily. She had been standing near the base of the stairs, looking around nervously, when something or someone had grabbed her. The others rushed down to find her, but she was gone. The air was empty, except for the echo of her scream that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the lighthouse. Lily, Sarah cried, her voice breaking. We need to get out of here, Dave said, panic rising in his chest. Now! But it was too late. The door slammed shut, trapping them inside. One by one, the friends disappeared. First, Dave was taken, vanishing without a trace, his flashlight flickering out in the darkness. Then, Sarah was pulled from the stairs, her terrified cries cutting off abruptly as the walls seemed to close in around her. Matt, determined to survive, tried to break the door open, but the lighthouse refused to yield. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they filled his mind, drowning out all rational thought. What is this? Matt gasped, backing away in terror. What is happening? The answer came not in words, but in the form of a figure. A tall, gaunt man emerged from the shadows, his face twisted with madness. The lighthouse keeper. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and unblinking, his skin pale and ashen. He was dressed in tattered clothing, his hands shaking as he reached for Matt. You shouldn't have come here, the keeper said, his voice low and raspy, as if he hadn't spoken in years. You've awoken them. Yep. Matt managed to gasp, his legs trembling with fear. The souls, the keeper continued, his voice filled with a strange, twisted glee. The souls of those who died in the shipwrecks. They never left, and neither did I. Matt's heart raced as he realized the truth. The lighthouse was not just haunted, it was a prison. The souls of the lost had been trapped here for eternity, and the keeper had been their warden, feeding on their fear to keep the lighthouse alive. His madness had come from the weight of the souls he kept locked in this cursed place, feeding off them, hoping to prevent the next disaster. But Matt knew it was too late. As the keeper advanced on him, the walls of the lighthouse seemed to pulse with life, and the whispers crescendoed into screams. The spirits, the souls of the wrecked ships, were coming for him. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and the lighthouse shook, as though something was trying to break free. He turned to run, but the air was thick with an unseen force, pushing him back toward the center of the room. He could feel the cold, clammy hands of the lost souls grasping at him. dragging him down into the very depths of the lighthouse. The keeper's laughter echoed through the corridors as Matt's cries were swallowed by the dark, and the lighthouse door slowly creaked open, releasing the next group of unsuspecting souls who had come to explore. The lighthouse stood silent once again, waiting for the next group of victims to cross its threshold. The keeper's job was never done, and the souls, forever trapped in the dark, would continue to whisper to anyone who dared listen. Story 4. The Creature from the Depths. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a golden glow on the ocean below. Mark Simmons adjusted his diving mask and checked the gear one final time, feeling the weight of the ocean pressing down on him as he prepared for the solo expedition. The small beach town where he had rented the equipment was sleepy, quiet, and filled with the usual chatter about ancient legends and unexplained occurrences beneath the waves. But to Mark, a seasoned diver, it was just another day to explore the deep. He had heard rumors of an underwater cave hidden somewhere off the coast, a place that no one had ever ventured into. Intrigued, Mark decided to discover it for himself. He made his way out into the water, his fins cutting through the surface as he dove deeper and deeper, leaving the world above behind. The water was cooler the farther down he went, and the sunlight dimmed as he descended into the shadows of the ocean. After hours of searching, Mark's flashlight beam finally landed on the entrance to a cave hidden beneath a jagged cliff. The mouth of the cave was narrow, almost concealed by dark seaweed, but Mark could see that it opened into the vast expanse of an underwater chamber beyond. With a mixture of excitement and cautious curiosity, he slipped through the opening and into the cave. The walls were adorned with strange carvings, intricate symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The deeper he swam, the more pronounced the markings became, wrapping around the stone like veins in the skin of some ancient, forgotten creature. There were also artifacts scattered on the seabed, broken pottery, tarnished tools, and weathered relics, all seemingly untouched for centuries. His heart raced as he realized he had stumbled upon a lost civilization, one that no human had seen in millennia. Mark carefully approached the relics, marveling at the craftsmanship. He reached out to touch one of the artifacts, a small, ornate idol, its design unlike anything he had ever seen. It was smooth, almost alive in its texture, and when his fingers brushed against it, a surge of energy pulsed through the water. The idol hummed softly, and for a moment, Mark felt a strange unease wash over him. But his desire for discovery overpowered his instincts. He carefully picked up the relic, tucking it into the pouch on his belt. The moment the idol was removed, the water around him seemed to shift. A low rumble echoed from the depths, reverberating through the cave walls. Mark froze, his pulse quickening. He glanced around, but everything seemed still. Suddenly, the water around him grew colder, much colder, and a dark shape began to emerge from the depths. Mark's eyes widened in terror as he saw it, a massive, otherworldly creature rising from the black abyss. Its long, sinewy body was covered in slick, glistening scales that shimmered in the dim light of his flashlight. Its eyes, glowing like twin orbs of molten gold, fixed on him with a predatory gaze. The creature's gaping maw was lined with rows of jagged teeth, each one large enough to swallow a manhole. A primal instinct kicked in, and Mark's breath caught in his throat. He was no longer exploring an ancient ruin. He was face to face with something far older, something that had been lurking in the deepest, most forgotten parts of the ocean for eons. The creature's body coiled and shifted with unnatural speed, its enormous tail flicking like a whip, sending waves crashing through the cave. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he kicked his legs and swam toward the cave entrance, but the creature was fast, too fast. As Mark pushed through the narrow opening and into open water, he felt the oppressive weight of the ocean closing in around him. His heart thudded in his ears as he raced toward the surface, the cold, dark water rushing past him. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel the presence of the creature, something ancient and malicious, chasing him, its movements swift and calculated. Breaching the surface with a gasp of air, Mark fumbled to remove his diving mask, his chest heaving with panic. The boat was still some distance away, bobbing gently in the calm waters. But even as he swam toward it, the water behind him began to swirl and froth. The creature had followed. Mark reached the boat, his arms trembling with exhaustion, and scrambled aboard. He looked around frantically for the creature, but it was nowhere in sight. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that he had escaped. But then he heard it, a soft, gurgling growl beneath the surface of the water. His heart skipped a beat as the sound grew louder, and the water around him began to churn violently. The creature was circling beneath him, its massive form moving with deliberate slowness, almost as if it were toying with its prey. Mark grabbed the anchor rope and hauled himself toward the engine, his hands slick with sweat and fear. He managed to start the motor, the boat's engine roaring to life. But just as the boat surged forward, the water beneath him erupted in a violent splash. The creature's massive head broke through the surface, its jaws wide open as it lunged toward the boat. Mark's stomach dropped as he saw the size of it, its gaping mouth wide enough to swallow the entire vessel whole. He yanked the throttle, sending the boat racing toward the horizon. But the creature was relentless. It pursued, diving under the waves, then rising again with terrifying speed. For what felt like hours, Mark fought to stay ahead of the creature, the boat skimming across the water, the dark beast never far behind. But the creature wasn't just hunting him, it was sending a message. Mark's mind raced as he realized that the creature's actions were not merely out of hunger. It was trying to prevent him from revealing what lay beneath the ocean. The ocean floor held secrets that had been buried for a reason. The relics, the carvings, the civilization. Everything Mark had uncovered had been part of something far darker. The creature, an ancient predator from a time before humans, was the guardian of these secrets, and its rage was a warning. Some things were never meant to be discovered. Mark's escape, as temporary as it seemed, was a fleeting illusion. The creature's pursuit continued, and the knowledge of what lay beneath the waves was forever branded in his mind. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. The ocean had given him a glimpse of something ancient, something powerful, and it would not let him forget it. As the boat raced toward the shore, Mark glanced back one last time. The creature's eyes glowed from the depths, and its monstrous silhouette swam just beneath the surface, waiting for the next curious soul to come too close. And the ocean, as always, remained silent, keeping its secrets well below the surface. Story 5. The Creature Beneath the Sand. The sun was bright as the Matthews family set up their beach spot, excited for a relaxing week by the ocean. Greg, his wife Sarah, and their 2 kids, Emma and Jake, had come to this quiet beach town to escape the chaos of their busy lives. The kids were eager to build a sandcastle, and Sarah was happy to let them enjoy the sunshine while she read a book under the umbrella. Greg, feeling nostalgic for his childhood days of carefree beach adventures, joined in with his children, grabbing a shovel and beginning to dig alongside them. As the day wore on, the family dug deeper and deeper into the sand, their sandcastle growing larger and more intricate. But when Greg's shovel struck something hard, it didn't sound like the typical resistance of compacted sand. It was something else, something buried far below the surface. Curious, he knelt down and began to dig around the object, his hands brushing away the sand to reveal what looked like a strange, weathered stone. The object was smooth and dark, covered in what appeared to be ancient symbols. It was almost perfectly round, but with strange ridges running across its surface. Greg, intrigued by the unusual shape, carefully picked it up. The moment his fingers made contact, the ground around him seemed to tremble. He quickly pulled his hands back, startled by the sensation of the sand shifting beneath him. "Dad, what's that?" Jake asked, looking at the object with wide eyes. Greg shrugged, uncertain but amused. "Not sure, buddy. Probably some old artifact. Just a piece of rock or something." But as they continued to stare at the strange object, the ground beneath them began to shift again, this time with more force. The sand trembled in unnatural patterns, as though something was moving beneath it. Emma and Jake looked up at their father, fear creeping into their expressions. "Mom, I don't like this," Emma said, her voice shaky. Sarah looked up from her book, sensing the change in the air. "What's going on?" "Greg." Greg frowned. "I don't know, but we should probably cover this back up. Maybe it's best to leave things alone." They buried the object back into the sand, but the disturbance had already set something into motion. That night, as the family settled into their rental cottage just off the beach, the sounds began. It started with faint noises like something scraping beneath the floorboards. Sarah thought it was just the house settling, but as the night deepened, the sounds grew louder and more distinct. It was as if something was moving under the ground, slowly and deliberately. The wind howled outside, but these sounds were coming from beneath the earth, rhythmic and insistent. Greg, still skeptical of the local legend that warned of creatures buried beneath the sand, dismissed the noises as nothing more than the shifting of the tides or the wind, despite the strange quality to them. He brushed it off as the natural, harmless sounds of being so close to the ocean. But the following day, things took a darker turn. The family returned to the beach, planning to enjoy their time in the sun. However, when they reached their usual spot, they found the sandcastle they had built the day before completely obliterated. The sand kicked up in unnatural mounds and ridges. And most concerning of all, the area where the mysterious object had been unearthed was now completely unsettled. It looked as though something massive had moved under the surface of the beach. Greg's unease began to grow, but he still tried to convince himself it was just the wind, maybe even a heavy tide. However, the closer they got to the area, the more palpable the tension in the air became. It felt as though something was watching them, waiting for them to make a wrong move. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the noises returned, louder this time. It wasn't just a scraping sound. There were low, guttural growls, faint whispers carried on the wind, and something that almost sounded like a thumping, as if a massive body was stirring beneath the earth. Greg stood by the door, his hands shaking slightly as he looked toward the beach. "I think we need to leave," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Something's wrong here. I don't know what it is, but I don't like it." As nightfall settled in, the family gathered inside, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that clung to the air. But then, in the dead of night, the ground shifted again. Only this time, it was violent. The house groaned, as if the very earth beneath it was being torn apart. Greg's heart raced as the ground outside began to crack, sand bursting upward in small geysers. A chill ran down his spine, and the noise from below intensified. It was a deep, rumbling growl, so close it felt as though it were coming from beneath the house itself. It was no longer just the sand shifting. It was alive, something ancient and terrible awakening from its slumber. Without warning, the ground beneath them exploded. The earth buckled and cracked, sending waves of sand flying into the air. Greg's legs were knocked out from under him, and he hit the ground hard. He heard Sarah scream as the kids shouted in panic, but the terrifying noise from beneath the ground drowned everything else out. The air was thick with dust, and as Greg tried to rise, a dark shadow emerged from the sand, a massive, tentacle-like appendage, slick and covered in sharp, barbed spines. Greg barely had time to react before the creature's tendril shot toward him, grabbing him by the leg with terrifying force. He screamed, but the sound was muffled by the deafening growls of the creature, which now rose from beneath the sand like an ancient titan. Its eyes, glowing yellow with hunger, fixed on Greg, and its gaping mouth, lined with rows of jagged teeth, opened wide. "Greg!" Sarah cried, her voice breaking. She pulled Emma and Jake behind her, but the creature's tendrils were already reaching toward them. Greg struggled, his heart hammering in his chest as he tried to break free. But the creature's grip tightened, pulling him toward the sand with relentless force. As he fought against it, he saw the horror in his family's eyes, the realization that they had disturbed something ancient and terrible. The creature's form was too vast to comprehend, its body like a shifting mound of sand and muscle, its eyes burning with an intelligence that had been buried for centuries. In a final act of desperation, Greg managed to break free, but only for a moment. He turned to Sarah, his voice hoarse with panic. "Run! You have to get away!" But as Greg turned to escape, the ground beneath him collapsed completely, and the creature's tendrils wrapped around him once again, dragging him beneath the sand. His last sight was of Sarah and the kids scrambling to escape, but it was too late. The creature's maw opened wide, swallowing him whole. The Matthews family's vacation had come to an end, but the creature beneath the sand was not finished. It had been disturbed, awakened from its slumber, and now it was hungry for more. Its tendrils reached above the sand, ready to claim anyone who dared to venture too close. The beach, once a place of family fun, had become a hunting ground for an ancient terror, and the creature would not rest until its vengeance was complete. The night had settled into a deep and unsettling silence as the old man's voice trailed off. He leaned back in his creaky wooden chair, his eyes distant and glazed, as if seeing something far beyond the dim, flickering light of the fire that burned low between them. The traveler, feeling both shaken and oddly compelled, sat still, absorbing every word of the old man's tales. One by one, each story had peeled back layers of horror, revealing the truth of the beach, the dark, malevolent force that lurked beneath the waves, the restless spirits that lingered long after death, and the creatures that had been buried in the sand for centuries, waiting for those foolish enough to disturb their slumber. The traveler had heard of the beach's reputation, of course, the warnings from locals, the hushed voices that spoke of things best left unsaid. But listening to the old man's stories, hearing them retold with such vivid detail, made everything feel more real. Each story, each horrific discovery, had been a chapter of something far more sinister than mere myth. The lost souls of the wrecked ships, the creature beneath the sand, the lighthouse keeper who never left, all of it was true. And now, the old man had warned him. The beach would always claim those who dared to disturb it. The traveler felt a chill settle in his bones. He had arrived thinking it was just another quiet spot to visit, a beach with some stories to tell, a place to unwind. But now, the beach felt like a living thing, pulsing with the weight of ancient secrets. The old man's words echoed in his mind. The ocean never forgets. It never forgives. The fire crackled, sending small embers floating into the night air. The old man took a deep breath, as though sighing away the last remnants of his stories. The beach, it claims what it's owed, he muttered, more to himself than to the traveler. And there's no leaving it once you've tasted its curse. The traveler sat in silence, the weight of the stories settling heavily upon his chest. He had been warned, but still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling to him, a whispering voice from the depths of the ocean, hidden just beneath the waves. His mind raced, trying to process everything he had learned. As the old man fell silent, the traveler stood, unable to shake the overwhelming sense of unease that had crept into his thoughts. He thanked the old man, but his mind was elsewhere, already lost in the thoughts of the creatures, the ghosts, and the strange relics buried beneath the sands. He made his way down to the beach, the moonlight casting long shadows over the shore. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks seemed almost louder now, as if urging him to approach the water. His footsteps were hesitant, unsure, but there was something inside him, a curiosity he couldn't quite extinguish, that drew him closer. The wind had picked up, and as it tousled his hair, he heard something faint, almost imperceptible. Whispers, soft and eerie, carried on the wind. It was as though the voices were coming from the very tide itself, beckoning him closer to the water. They weren't just sounds. They were words, old and ancient, spoken in a language he couldn't understand but felt deep in his gut. The traveler stopped at the water's edge, his heart pounding. He looked out over the waves, and for a moment, it felt as though the ocean was watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The old man's warning echoed in his mind, and for the first time, the traveler felt the weight of its truth. The beach wasn't just a place. It was a force, an entity unto itself, and the sea was its keeper. He turned away, a shiver running down his spine. He had come to the beach to explore, to uncover the mysteries it held. But now he understood that some things were better left buried, untouched by human hands. He had disturbed the place with his curiosity, and in doing so, He had awakened something far older than he could fathom. As he walked away, heading back toward the safety of the town, the whispers followed him. They were faint, almost lost to the wind, but they were there, just on the edge of hearing. They carried with them a promise, or perhaps a warning. You can leave, but the beach will never leave you. The traveler quickened his pace, trying to block out the whispers, but they lingered in his mind, like a song that wouldn't fade. No matter how far he walked, they were there in the back of his thoughts, urging him to return, to listen, to uncover the truth buried beneath the waves. But the truth was something he had already learned. The beach had its secrets, and not all of them were meant to be uncovered. The creatures, the spirits, the curses, they were not myths or legends. They were real, and the ocean, with its infinite depths, held countless more that would remain forever hidden. Some mysteries were meant to stay unsolved. As the traveler reached the outskirts of the town, he glanced back at the beach one last time. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its silver glow over the water, making the waves look like a shifting blanket of dark secrets. The whispers seemed to grow louder, as if they were calling his name. With a final shudder, the traveler turned away and walked into the town, leaving the beach and the ocean behind. But the whispers stayed with him, carried by the wind. And though he tried to forget, he knew that the ocean would always remember. The stories the old man had shared were not just warnings, they were lessons. The sea was a place that demanded respect, a place that kept its secrets buried deep within its depths. Curiosity, as the traveler had learned, could lead to terrible consequences. Some things once uncovered could never be forgotten. The beach, the ocean, the creatures that lurk beneath. They were not to be understood or tamed. Some mysteries were meant to stay hidden, lost to time. The beach would claim anyone foolish enough to disturb it. It had claimed the traveler's curiosity, and with it, a part of his soul would always be tethered to the whispers of the tide. The sea, after all, never forgets.